in a remote forest nestled deep within the Canadian wilderness. The long, harsh winters stretched on for what seemed like an eternity. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches weighed down by heavy blankets of snow. The wind howled through the branches, carrying with it the sharp bite of cold that permeated every inch of the forest. In the midst of this vast and untamed land lived Bailey Thompson, a woman of 63 years, who had chosen to leave behind the hustle and bustle of city life after the death of her beloved husband. She had once been part of the busy, noisy world of urban living, but after the loss of her partner, she had found solace in the quiet embrace of the forest. Bailey lived alone in a simple log cabin, tucked away in the heart of the wilderness, where the only sounds she heard were the whisper of the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional call of a distant animal. Her life was simple, but it was her own. Bailey had always been a strong, independent woman. Even as she grew older, she remained self-sufficient, tending to her cabin, chopping wood, and growing her own food. The forest was her sanctuary, and she cared for it as one would care for a beloved home. Every tree, every stream, every trail felt like a part of her. The forest had become a second home to her, a place where she could breathe freely and find peace in the rhythm of nature. But one cold winter morning, as Bailey was sitting by her small stove, sipping her tea and watching the snow fall gently outside, she heard something that broke the stillness of her world. It was a low, pitiful sound, carried on the wind, something that didn't belong to the usual chorus of birds and animals she had come to know. It was a soft, desperate whimper, a cry that sent a shiver down her spine. Bailey's heart raced as she put down her cup of tea and stood up, her old boots crunching against the snow as she stepped outside into the bitter cold. The forest was eerily silent now, the usual sounds of wildlife hushed by the heavy snowfall. The wind had picked up, swirling the snow in a chaotic dance. But Bailey's attention was focused on the faint sound that had drawn her outside. She followed the sound, moving slowly through the thick snow, her breath visible in the cold air. It was coming from a small ravine, a place Bailey knew well. The ravine was narrow and deep, flanked by steep rock faces covered in moss and snow. She had explored it many times in her younger years, and though it was a treacherous spot, she felt a strange pull to it now. The sound was clearer now, no longer just a faint cry, but a distressed whimper that broke her heart with its desperation. Bailey quickened her pace, her old joints protesting as she made her way toward the ravine. As she reached the edge, she stopped dead in her tracks. What she saw there took her breath away. There, in a small, snow-covered hollow between two boulders, lay 3 tiny bear cubs, their fur matted and their bodies trembling in the cold. Their eyes were wide with fear, their small mouths opening and closing in weak cries. The sight of them, so vulnerable and abandoned, struck Bailey to her core. She took a cautious step forward, her heart heavy with the realization of what had happened. The cubs were clearly too young to be on their own. They couldn't have wandered this far by themselves. Bailey's mind raced as she pieced together what must have happened. The forest was a dangerous place, especially in the winter, and the idea that these cubs had been left alone like this was almost too much to bear. Bailey knelt down, her knees creaking as she lowered herself to the ground. She reached out slowly, her hands trembling as she tried to soothe the frightened cubs. They were so small, no bigger than her old dog, their fur patchy and unkempt. She could see that they were weak from hunger, their bellies swollen with the effort of searching for food in a landscape that offered little to eat. Her heart sank as she realized that their mother was nowhere to be found. She looked around the ravine, but there was no sign of the mother bear, no fresh tracks, no sign of life. The more she thought about it, the more she feared the worst. The mother bear had likely been killed, either by poachers or hunters, leaving these helpless cubs to fend for themselves in a world that was far too harsh for them to survive on their own. Bailey's stomach twisted with grief and anger. She knew the dangers of the forest all too well, but the thought of these innocent creatures being abandoned like this, left to die alone, was too much to bear. These cubs needed her, and though she had nothing left to give, she couldn't walk away. With great care, Bailey gently scooped the cubs into her arms. One by one, they were light, fragile little things, and as she cradled them against her chest, she could feel their tiny bodies trembling in the cold. Her heart broke at the thought of what they had been through, and the weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't leave them here. She had to try to save them. Bailey stood up slowly, her back aching from the effort. But she didn't hesitate. She had always been a fighter, and now she would fight for these cubs, just as she had fought for her own survival all these years. She knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, that there would be risks, challenges, and heartache, but she couldn't turn her back on them. She would bring them home, keep them warm, and do everything in her power to help them survive. Bailey carefully made her way back through the snow-covered woods. The cubs nestled in her arms, their soft whimpers filling the silence around her. As she walked, she made a silent promise to them, to herself, and to the memory of the mother bear that had given him life. She would protect them. She would give them a chance at a life they had no business living without a mother. And for the first time in a long while, Bailey felt a renewed sense of purpose. The forest that had once been her sanctuary would now become the place where she would fight for life. Not just for her own, but for the fragile creatures that shared it with her. As she approached her cabin, she could already feel the weight of the cubs' dependence on her. They needed warmth, food, and care. She would give them that. And more. She would protect them, and in doing so, she would find a new sense of belonging. One that wasn't defined by loss or loneliness, but by the shared bond between herself and the creatures of the wild. This was her new purpose. And as Bailey opened the door to her cabin and stepped inside with the 3 bear cubs in her arms, she knew that her life had changed forever. The forest had given her a second chance, and she would honor it by giving the cubs the chance to survive. Bailey stood in the doorway of her small cabin, her breath visible in the frigid air, and watched as the 3 bear cubs huddled together in a corner of her porch. They were small, vulnerable creatures, their bodies weak from hunger and the harshness of the world they had been abandoned in. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her, but Bailey knew there was no turning back. The stormy winter that gripped the forest was unrelenting, and without help, these cubs wouldn't survive. She had seen enough of the forest's cruelty to know that if she didn't act, they would perish, just like so many animals did in the unforgiving wilderness. But Bailey wasn't the kind of woman to walk away from a challenge, especially not one that called to her heart. She had lived a solitary life, built on the quiet strength of the land, and this was her moment to give back to the creatures that had shared her home all these years. With a quiet resolve, she stepped outside, gently calling the cubs to her. They were skittish at first, too frightened to trust her fully. But hunger had a way of overcoming fear. Slowly, they followed her, their small, trembling bodies inching closer to the warmth of the cabin. Bailey bent down, careful not to scare him off, and cradled them in her arms. They were so light, so fragile, and for a moment, she felt the weight of their dependence on her. It was overwhelming, but it also filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She carefully carried him inside, closing the door against the cold that seemed to seep into every corner of the cabin. Once inside, she gently set the cubs down by the hearth, where the fire crackled and cast a warm glow across the room. Bailey had built this place with her own 2 hands, and it had always been a refuge from the harsh elements outside. Now, it would become a sanctuary for these orphaned cubs. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Raising 3 bear cubs in a cabin that was meant for one was going to take patience, care, and above all, caution. Bailey wasn't naive. She knew that these cubs were wild animals, not pets. They had instincts that could be unpredictable. And while they might be small and helpless now, they would grow quickly, and their needs would become more complex. She had no intention of treating them like pets. She wanted them to grow strong and capable, to understand their place in the wild. Even though they had lost their mother, she didn't want him to forget who they were or where they came from. Over the next few days, Bailey carefully began to care for the cubs. She fed them cow's milk, knowing it wasn't ideal but the best she could offer in their fragile state. They drank eagerly, their little mouths working to lap up the milk. But there was always a sense of hunger in their eyes, as though they knew there was something more out there for them. Something their instincts were telling them they needed. Bailey didn't just feed them, though. She taught them how to forage, how to search for food, how to use their noses to find what they needed. Each morning, she would take him out into the snow, showing him the trails of deer and squirrels, pointing out the patches of bark they could nibble on, and guiding them to the small, hidden streams where they could drink fresh water. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Bailey wasn't sure if they would ever learn everything they needed to survive. But she was determined to give them a chance. She worked tirelessly, making sure they were safe and warm, and teaching them the skills they would need to navigate the wilderness once they were strong enough. But despite her best efforts to keep a certain distance, to let them retain their wildness, there were moments when the cubs needed comfort, needed warmth, and in those moments, Bailey couldn't help but offer it. At night, when the wind howled through the trees and the snow piled up outside, Bailey would sit by the fire, her hands busy with knitting or mending, and the cubs would gather around her. It started as a small thing, their soft, tentative approach, the way they would sit close to her, their little bodies still trembling from the cold. But over time, it became a routine. When the fire burned low, they would come to her, their eyes filled with a quiet trust, and curl up around her, forming a little circle of warmth by the hearth. Bailey didn't mind. In fact, those moments were a comfort to her too. There was something deeply soothing about the weight of their bodies against her legs, the sound of their soft breathing, and the warmth they brought to her cabin. In those rare, quiet moments, the loneliness that had haunted her for so many years seemed to fade away, replaced by the simple joy of being surrounded by life, by the creatures she had chosen to protect. She knew it wasn't ideal, that she was blurring the line between human and animal care, but she couldn't help it. The cubs had no mother. And she had no family. It felt right, in a way she couldn't quite explain, to share these quiet nights with them. They were hers now, as much as she was theirs. The bond was unspoken, but it was there, growing with each passing day. Bailey watched as the cubs grew stronger, their fur filling out, their bodies becoming more solid. They began to play, tumbling over each other in the snow, testing their strength, their agility. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about growing up. About learning what it meant to be a bear. Bailey didn't intervene in their play. She let them explore, let them practice, but she watched from a distance, keeping them safe from the dangers of the forest, knowing that it was only a matter of time before they would have to leave her and return to the wild. She didn't know when that would happen, but she was ready. She had given them everything she could. And now, it was up to them to survive. In the meantime, she had the quiet companionship of the cubs, the comfort of their presence, and the warmth of the fire at her back. Bailey Thompson, a woman who had once been alone, had found a family in the most unexpected of places. The forest that had taken so much from her had also given her something more precious than she could have imagined, a chance to protect and love, to nurture and guide. And in the silence of the winter nights, as the wind howled and the fire crackled, Bailey felt not the ache of loneliness, but the quiet joy of being exactly where she was meant to be. One crisp winter afternoon, as Bailey was gathering firewood near her cabin, she heard the familiar sound of boots crunching through the snow. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Joe, her old neighbor and longtime friend, was making his way toward her. Joe had lived in the forest for as long as she had. A seasoned hunter with a deep respect for the land, but also a man who understood the delicate balance of nature. Bailey had known him for years, ever since she had first moved into the cabin, and while they weren't as close as they once were, they had shared enough history to know each other well. Joe had always been the kind of person who appreciated silence, who valued the peace that came with living in the wild. But there was something different about him today. His footsteps were heavier, more deliberate, and his face was creased with concern when he finally reached Bailey. She set the wood down, wiping her hands on her thick woolen gloves, and gave him a warm smile, though she could see the seriousness in his eyes. "Well, look who's come out to brave the cold," Bailey said, her voice friendly but curious. "What brings you around this way?" Joe didn't immediately return the smile. Instead, he took a deep breath, the cold air puffing out in a cloud, and his gaze shifted to the woods behind her cabin. For a moment, Bailey thought he was going to mention the weather or the usual small talk they shared. But instead, he said something that immediately grabbed her attention. "Bailey, I need to talk to you about those bear cubs you've been taking care of," he said, his voice serious, his usual warmth replaced by something more cautious. Bailey felt a knot form in her stomach at his words, but she didn't show it. She had been expecting this moment for some time. It wasn't the first time she'd heard concerns about the cubs, but something in Joe's tone told her that this conversation would be different. "What about them?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Joe let out a long sigh, shaking his head as he took a step closer. "I've been watching them," he said, his eyes narrowing as he glanced over at the cabin where the three cubs were playing in the snow, their small bodies tumbling around as they tested their growing strength. "And I'm telling you, Bailey, they're going to get big. And fast." Those little cubs won't stay little for long. In a few months, they'll be as big as a full-grown dog. And when that happens, they'll become dangerous. You know how unpredictable bears can be, especially when they're no longer cubs. They'll start hunting for themselves. And it won't be just berries and roots they'll go after. You don't want to be in the way when that happens. Bailey's heart tightened, but she kept her face neutral. She had heard these warnings before from others. But Joe's words hit a little harder. She had always known that the cubs would grow quickly. But it was hard to face the reality of it all. They had been so small when she first found them. So helpless. And she had poured her heart into caring for them. They were more than just animals to her. They were a reminder that life could still have meaning. Even after loss, she had grown attached to them. Watching them grow stronger each day. Their eyes filled with a quiet trust. But Joe's warning was not lost on her. She knew the dangers of the forest. She knew the wild. And she knew that nature was unforgiving. I understand, Joe, Bailey said softly, her voice calm but filled with the weight of what he was saying. I know they'll get big. But they've been through so much already. I can't just leave them to fend for themselves in the middle of winter. They're not ready, not yet. Joe gave her a long look. His gaze softening slightly as he took in the sincerity in her voice. He had known Bailey long enough to understand her stubbornness and her deep connection to the creatures of the forest. It was one of the things he respected about her, her willingness to care for those who couldn't care for themselves. But he also knew the risks. He had seen the outcome of poorly judged decisions. And the forest had a way of demanding its toll. I know you're doing what you think is right, Bailey, he said quietly, his tone gentler now, though still filled with concern. But you can't treat them like pets. They're wild animals, and if you keep them too close, you're only setting yourself up for trouble. Bailey nodded slowly, taking in his words. She didn't want to admit it. But he was right. The cubs couldn't stay in the cabin forever. They were animals, and they belonged in the wild, not cooped up in a human home. But that didn't change the fact that she felt responsible for them. They had no one else. And the thought of sending them out into the harsh winter alone filled her with dread. She had already lost so much. And she wasn't ready to lose these cubs. Too. I know, she said after a long pause. I've been trying to keep a distance. To remind him they're wild. But sometimes, especially at night, they come close. They're so young, and the cold gets to them. I can't turn him away when they need warmth. Joe didn't say anything for a moment. He seemed to be weighing her words. His eyes studying her face as though trying to gauge whether she truly understood the danger she was putting herself in. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer. Just promise me you'll be careful, Bailey, he said. They're not puppies. You've got a good heart. But the forest doesn't always care about that. I've seen people, good people, underestimate the power of nature. And it doesn't always end well. Bailey stood silently for a moment, her gaze drifting over to where the cubs were playing. Their movements still clumsy but growing more confident each day. She knew Joe's words were wise. He had spent years in the wilderness, tracking and hunting, living by the rhythm of the land. He knew the dangers better than anyone, and she respected him for it. But she also knew that what she had done for these cubs couldn't be undone. She had already opened her heart to them. And there was no turning back. I'll be careful, Joe, Bailey said, her voice steady. I promise. I'll keep my distance. But I can't just leave them out there. Not yet. They've already lost their mother. I can't make them face the world alone. Joe didn't argue. He simply nodded, his expression softening. I know you care, Bailey, but you've got to think long term. They won't stay small forever. And you're not getting any younger, either. His tone was a mix of concern and fondness. He had known Bailey long enough to understand her determination, her fierce loyalty to the animals she had taken in. But he also knew the forest was a harsh teacher. And sometimes, even the best intentions couldn't save you from the consequences of the wild. Bailey looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I'm not going anywhere, Joe, but I'll think about what you said. I promise. With that, Joe gave her one last look, his eyes filled with both worry and affection. Before turning and disappearing back into the forest, Bailey stood in the cold for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. The cubs were her responsibility now, and no matter what the future held, she knew she couldn't abandon them. She would protect them, as long as she could. And as she turned back toward her cabin, the warmth of the fire calling to her, she knew the path ahead would be uncertain, but with the cubs by her side, she would face whatever came with courage and love. On a warm summer day, the sun filtered through the trees of the forest, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. Bailey Thompson, now accustomed to the forest and its rhythms, walked along a familiar trail with the 3 bear cubs at her side. They had grown quickly since the winter, their fur thick and their movements more confident. The cubs followed Bailey closely, occasionally stopping to nibble on some berries or root they found, but always returning to her side. They had become part of her life in a way she hadn't anticipated. And in return, she had become their protector, guiding them through the dangers of the wilderness. As they walked deeper into the forest, Bailey noticed something unusual. The sounds of the forest, normally filled with the calls of birds and the rustle of small animals, seemed quieter than usual. The stillness in the air caught her attention, and a sudden sense of unease crept over her. Her senses, honed by years of living alone in the wild, tingled with a warning. It didn't take long before she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, human footsteps, moving swiftly through the underbrush. Her heart began to race. Bailey had lived in the forest long enough to recognize the signs of human activity. But she knew that not all people were to be trusted in these woods. She had encountered hunters before, men who didn't respect the balance of the wild and only saw the forest as a place to take what they wanted. Bailey's first instinct was to move the cubs to safety. She turned to them, her voice low but firm. Go, she whispered, pointing toward the dense thicket ahead. The cubs, now accustomed to Bailey's commands, understood immediately. Without hesitation, they scampered off into the underbrush, their small bodies disappearing into the safety of the trees. Bailey waited, holding her breath, listening as the footsteps grew louder, closer. Her heart pounded in her chest. There was no time to waste. She needed to protect the cubs. And she knew the only way to do so was to face whatever threat was coming head-on. As the hunters appeared in the clearing ahead, Bailey's worst fears were confirmed. There were 3 of them, dressed in camouflage, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They hadn't yet spotted her or the cubs, but they were getting closer. Bailey's hands instinctively went to the shotgun slung across her back. It wasn't much, but it was the only weapon she had, and it was enough to defend what mattered most. She steadied herself, gripping the rifle tightly, and stepped forward into the clearing, positioning herself between the hunters and the cubs. The men froze when they saw her. "What do you think you're doing?" one of them called out, his voice gruff and disapproving. Bailey stood tall, her eyes locked on the hunters, her face set in a determined expression. "I'm protecting them," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. "Those cubs are off limits. You leave them alone." The men exchanged confused glances, clearly surprised by her presence and the force in her voice. They hadn't expected to find a woman here, especially not one standing between them and their prey. "They're just bears," one of the hunters said dismissively. "What's the harm? We've got a right to hunt." Bailey's grip tightened on the gun. She knew they saw the cubs as nothing more than targets. But to her, they were her responsibility. "Not today," she said, her voice sharp. "Not while I'm standing here." The hunters laughed, but it was a nervous, uneasy sound. They had come into this forest expecting an easy hunt, not a confrontation with a determined woman who was willing to protect these animals with everything she had. Bailey could see the uncertainty in their eyes as they looked at her. They hadn't expected to encounter someone who wasn't afraid to stand up to them. And they certainly hadn't expected someone who was willing to fight for the cubs. The leader of the group stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're doing, lady," he said, his voice cold. "You're just a woman. You can't stop us." But Bailey wasn't backing down. She had seen too much in her years of living alone in the forest to let men like these take what didn't belong to them. The cubs weren't theirs to kill. And as far as Bailey was concerned, she would protect them, no matter the cost. She took a deep breath, her eyes not leaving the hunters. "I've lived here longer than you've been hunting in these woods," she said quietly, her voice calm but filled with an undeniable strength. "I know the forest better than you do. And I know what it means to protect what's mine. These cubs are mine to protect. You will not harm them." The hunters hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing their faces. They hadn't counted on a confrontation like this. They were used to intimidation, used to people cowering when they raised their rifles. But Bailey wasn't intimidated. She stood her ground, her body rigid with determination, the rifle still steady in her hands. The forest, the cubs, her home, it all mattered to her. And she wouldn't let anyone take that away from her. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them. The hunters exchanged another glance, their faces unreadable. Bailey didn't flinch. She didn't move an inch. She was ready to face whatever came next. Finally, the leader of the group spoke again, his voice reluctant but understanding. "You're serious, aren't you?" he said. "You really won't let us hunt them?" Bailey nodded once, her gaze unwavering. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect them." The men stood there for another tense moment, the weight of the standoff heavy in the air. And then, to her surprise, the hunters slowly lowered their rifles. They muttered something to each other, their words barely audible, but Bailey knew what it meant. They had decided to back down. It wasn't out of fear for her, but because they knew she wasn't going to give up. She had made it clear that she was willing to do whatever it took to protect these cubs. And they had no choice but to walk away. The leader looked at her one last time, his face begrudgingly respectful. "You're crazy. You know that," he said with a shake of his head. "But fine, we'll leave them alone." Bailey didn't say anything in response. She simply watched as the hunters turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest. As the last of them vanished from sight, Bailey lowered her rifle and let out a long breath. The tension in her body slowly began to dissipate. But her heart was still pounding. She had done it. She had protected the cubs. She turned and hurried back to where the cubs were hiding, her heart light with relief that they were safe. As she approached the thicket, she saw them peeking out from behind the trees, their eyes wide with curiosity and fear. Bailey smiled gently and motioned for them to come out. "It's okay," she said softly. "You're safe now." The cubs cautiously emerged from their hiding spot and slowly made their way back to her, their small bodies still trembling but comforted by her presence. Bailey knelt down, her arms outstretched to them, and as they snuggled into her embrace, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. She had done what she had promised herself she would do. She had protected them, and for that, she would never regret the choice she had made. After the hunters had finally turned and left, Bailey stood alone in the quiet of the forest, the weight of the confrontation still lingering in the air. Her hands shook slightly from the tension of the standoff, but deep down, she knew she had done the right thing. The cubs, safe for now, had hidden in the thicket, their small forms crouched in the shadows, waiting for her to return. Bailey's heart swelled with relief, but there was a bittersweet edge to it. The battle had been won, but the journey was far from over. As she made her way back to the place where the cubs had sought refuge, Bailey couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. The cubs had grown so much, and they had become a part of her life in a way she hadn't expected. They had filled the empty spaces in her heart, and for the first time in years, she felt a deep sense of purpose. They had needed her, and she had been there for them. But now, something had changed. She could feel it in the air, in the way the cubs seemed to carry themselves, in the way they moved when she approached. They were no longer the fragile, helpless creatures she had found in the snow. They were stronger now, their bodies filling out, their movements more confident. They had learned what they needed to survive, and they were ready. Bailey knew this moment would come. She had known from the start that one day, the cubs would no longer need her. It was the way of the wild, the way of life. And though she had loved them like her own, she knew that she couldn't hold them back from the life they were meant to lead. As she approached them, the cubs slowly emerged from their hiding place. Their eyes, once full of fear and uncertainty, now held a quiet understanding. They looked at Bailey with the same trust they had given her when they first came to her for help. But now, there was something else, something deeper in their gaze. It was as if they were telling her, without words, that they were ready to go. They had grown strong enough to face the world on their own. Bailey's heart tightened as she looked at them. She had raised them, cared for them, and watched them grow into the strong, wild creatures they were meant to be. But it was time for them to return to the wild. She had given him a chance, and now they would carry on without her. Slowly, one of the cubs stepped forward, its head held high, its movements steady and sure. The other two followed, their little bodies moving with purpose as they made their way toward the edge of the forest. Bailey felt her throat tighten as she watched them, her eyes filling with tears. She had known this day would come, but nothing could have prepared her for the ache in her chest as she realized that her time with them was coming to an end. The cubs turned back to her, as if to say one last goodbye. Bailey stood still, her heart heavy but filled with a quiet peace. She knew this was the right thing to do, even though it broke her heart. These cubs were meant to be wild. and they had learned all they could from her. It was time for them to live their lives as they were meant to. In the vast wilderness where they belonged. Go, Bailey whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. You're free now. I'll always remember you. With those words, the cubs turned once more and walked into the forest, their small bodies disappearing into the trees. Bailey stood there, watching them go, her heart aching with both pride and sorrow. She had done her part. She had given him a chance at life. And now, they would carry on without her. But even as the cubs vanished into the depths of the forest, Bailey knew that she would never truly be alone. In the stillness of the trees, in the wind that rustled through the leaves, she could hear their presence, feel their memory. They had been part of her life. And in a way, they always would be. The forest, once her solitary home, now held the echoes of their lives within it. Bailey stood for a long while, the tears on her cheeks freezing in the cold wind. But in the midst of the sadness, there was a strange sense of peace. She had given the cubs what they needed, and now they were free. She had loved them, protected them, and shown him the ways of the wild. And now, as she stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she knew that the forest would continue to be her home. It had always been there for her, and it always would be. And in return, she had done her part to ensure that the creatures who shared this land with her had a chance to thrive. Bailey felt a deep, quiet contentment settle over her. It wasn't the kind of happiness that came from grand accomplishments or fleeting moments of joy. It was a peace that came from knowing she had done her best. From knowing she had given everything she could to those who needed her. And as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Bailey turned and walked back toward her cabin. The forest, her home, would always be there, and she knew that, no matter what came next, she would never be truly alone. The cubs would remember her, just as she would remember them. They were part of the wild now, but they would always be a part of her. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.